Hi, Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 8 in our 11 video sequence on personal intelligence or cognitive ability. And this one is really to show you what forms of cognitive ability tests are used in the world today. So there are really 3 forms of cognitive ability assessment that are widely used. The first is untimed and administered. The second is classical online tests, and the third is adaptive online tests. And then you'll see this question of tests proctoring or invigilation. So proctoring or invigilation is where somebody does a psych test and you sit there and watch them. And that's called proctoring in the United States of America and the UK, or invigilation in the rest of the world. Invigilation just means watching people. Now, it's a really interesting question. Should tests be invigilated? And we do see in some high stakes environments, so for instance for police forces, people insist that people must do those tests in an invigilated environment where they come to a particular place and they sit there and they get assessed. But in fact, the ratio of cheating in those circumstances is very, very low. And there are some other things that can be done to do that. I mean, if you need to invigilate your own tests and you'll make your own judgment about that, then do that. But there are some other things that if you do it purely online, certainly AI proctoring is becoming more and more common, but there are some things that you can do to minimize cheating. So let's talk about untimed and administered tests. So examples of that would be the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. And typically these need to be administered by a trained administrator, and the administrator leads the subject through the assessment. Takes 45 minutes to an hour to administer. And this can be very helpful if there are reasons the person cannot complete an online assessment. They're expensive. In other words, if you're going to run these things, you need an administrator, and they tend to be time consuming. And that's why untimed administered tests tend not to be used as widely as online tests. Online tests are pretty quick and cheap to get up and running. And then there's classical online tests, and they're based on a thing called classical test theory, which I won't bore you with the details of that. But they have pencil and paper versions, and then they move them online. And standard lists of questions and numbers of questions, typically timed. So time tests for cognitive ability are typically 15 to 30 minutes each, but can be longer. The score tends to be based typically on how many the person got right. This is important to understand about online tests. They typically score you based on how many you get right. So if you have 20 minutes worth of testing and you get 15 right, in most cases it doesn't matter whether you attempted only 15 and got them all right, or whether you attempted 30 and got half right. It's still the same score. Now, is that valid? Well, in fact, it seems to be, because if you try to predict real-world outcomes, whether the person took approach number A, which is that they got them all right, or B, where they got half right, doesn't seem to affect the predictiveness of that cognitive ability test for predicting things like job performance. Now, whether a person will try them all and get certain right, or whether they'll be more fastidious and try 15 and get them all right, well, that's a matter of personality and values more than anything else. So these things tend to be very convenient to administer, and by a mile, this is the way that psych testing tends to be done in the world. Accurate, predicts job performance and other outcomes effectively, and it's convenient and affordable. And that's why people tend to use this sort of approach. And then you have the world of adaptive testing. Adaptive testing is where the test will change the questions depending on whether you get them right or wrong. So if you get a difficult question right, then it will crank up the difficulty of the test items. If you get it wrong, then it will ease off a little in the difficulty. Now, adaptive tests are a relatively recent invention, and they're typically based on a thing called item response theory. Again, that's a very different thing from classical test theory, and I won't bore you with the details. But item response theory tries to measure a thing called theta. That's the Greek letter theta that you see there. Theta is really what's the true trait of this characteristic in this person. So if we're trying to measure numerical reasoning, theta is how good I am at numerical reasoning. Now, we don't typically report theta values in these kinds of assessments. What we'll do is we'll convert that into something like a percentile. So if you're at the 50th percentile, you're right in the middle of the population. But theta is what adaptive tests are typically trying to measure so that it can then be converted into a more understandable result, like, for instance, a percentile. When you're building an adaptive test, the statistics of item response theory tells you how difficult the items are, tells you the degree to which they discriminate, And what that means is that if an item is good in terms of discrimination, it means it's accurately discriminating between people who are high in this ability and low in this ability. And it can also measure the degree to which people are guessing. And of course, that can be an extremely useful thing to understand. So typically the way an adaptive test works is you start the candidate on an item where theta is close to 0. In other words, the difficulty of that question is very close to population average. If they get it right, the next item gets more difficult. If they get it wrong, the next item will be easier. And we allocate a total number of items or total time. Now, after the person completes each question, you measure this thing called the standard error of measurement. And this is a completely different way of running psych tests. The standard error of measurement means how accurately have we measured this characteristic, this thing we're calling theta. So the standard error of measurement shrinks as you get more accurate. And an adaptive test may well stop when the standard error of measurement becomes small enough that we're really confident that we've collared this person's level of their ability on this thing. So if it's numbers, have we accurately measured that? Now, the benefit of this is that adaptive tests can be much shorter. In a range of studies of a range of adaptive tests, it's been found that you can end up with even 40% less items by virtue of running adaptive tests, because it's sort of honing in on the person's level of ability, whether that's numerical or verbal or abstract, whatever you're measuring. These tests may be timed or untimed, but certainly they can finish when the standard error of measurement becomes low enough. So that's how cognitive ability is measured. In the next video, we'll be giving you some example test items so you can actually see the types of questions that are used to measure this stuff. Click on the link near this video to join us.